All right. Well, if you have your sermon outline, feel free to pull that out from your bulletin and open up to Romans 2 in your Bible, if that helps you follow along. We are going to cover a larger passage than what Robert read for us a moment ago, so it's going to be all the way through the end of chapter 2. So fair warning, this may take a minute, but I'm sure it will all be perfectly edifying, I'm sure. So what are you proud of? What are you proud of? What are you proud of? Are you proud about parts of your character, maybe, that you're an honest person, or that you're funny, or that you keep your commitments that you said you're going to do? Maybe you're proud of some of your accomplishments. You're proud of your kids or your grandkids. You're proud of the home that you've built. Maybe you're proud of the way that you've stayed married over 40 years or 50 years. What are some of the things that you want people to cheer on and recognize? What are some of the things that you hope come up in conversation? What are some of the things that you hope I say now so you can elbow your spouse and say, it's me right there. Right? Some of you say, no, Bob, I'm not falling for this. This is a trap. I know I'm not supposed to be proud of stuff, and I know you're going to say that. And so I'm not proud of anything. I'm never proud of anything at all. It's not a trap, but you're right to be concerned about this, right? There's overwhelming language about the dangers of pride. It was in the list of sins a couple weeks ago at the end of Romans 1, where boasting is one of the markers of the sinful nature. Proverbs 3:34, which is quoted often in the New Testament, says, God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So we can say, all right, don't be proud about things. It's easier said than done, first of all, but it's also more complicated than that. The New Testament talks about there are things that Paul was proud of. 2 Corinthians 7:4, I have great pride in you. I am filled with comfort. In all our affliction, I am overflowing with joy. Or at the end of Romans 15, in Christ Jesus, I have reason to be proud of my work for God. All right, so it's not so easy as saying you can't be proud of anything. But the question then becomes, how do you distinguish these things? What are the things that we should be proud of and the things we shouldn't be proud of? And how do we tell the difference? Now, I think it'd be important to recognize this tension, not a contradiction. Contradiction is a different thing, but a tension over pride, right? Because we all have to have pride in something. Because if you've ever met someone who has no pride, it's not necessarily that they're humble, but that they're ashamed. The opposite of pride isn't humility, but shame. So what are we proud of, and what should we be proud of? And why does pride turn toxic at other times? Well, we're going to talk about that today, because we're going to talk specifically about the tendency that humans have to take pride in the wrong aspects of our faith. We're going to look here at the end of Romans 2 at the way that some of the people in Paul's generation, and we'll talk about our generation as well, take pride in their religiosity in a way that separated themselves from God. It's not simple enough to say you should only take pride in this category of things and not that category of things. It actually has more to do with, in this passage, with the way that we approach pride in relation to our neighbor and in relation to God. So we'll talk about some of the hazardous ways to take pride today. Pride in comparison, knowing what other people don't know. I wanted them all to be C's, so I'm going to stretch this next one. Cognitive morality, knowing the good when we don't do it, and commitment markers, taking pride in displays of spirituality that don't match our lives. So there's sort of 3 significant paragraphs in your passage, in your Bible. You'll see them there. We'll do sort of one paragraph at a time in the time allowed to us today, and hopefully we'll see ourselves in the passage in ways that remind us the goodness of God and the goodness of the gospel. So Romans 2. We've been going through the book of Romans all year this year. You might remember that in chapter 1 we talked about this sort of header verse that Paul uses there in Romans 1 where he says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of salvation to all who would believe. And then over the last few weeks we've talked about how that gospel sort of tells us a lot of the sad news of the human condition. The descriptions of the sinfulness of the Gentiles, that's in chapter 1. And then in chapter 2, Jason talked about last week how Paul turns the page to Jewish believers as well, that they have marks of the fall in their life as well. Now we're going to pick it up in verse 12 while Paul says that the law itself is going to be a mirror back to us about our own sinfulness. So let's read verse 12 together. When I say together, I'm going to read it out loud. I mean, you can read it out loud too, but that might be kind of weird for your neighbor. Verse 12. For all have sinned without the law. For all who have sinned without the law will also perish without the law. And all who have sinned under the law will be judged by the law. For it is not the hearers of the law who are righteous before God, but the doers of the law who will be justified. So here's the objection that Paul's answering in his mind. He's sort of answering in his mind the person who says, I'm glad you have the gospel, but I have the law. And we know the law is in the Bible, it's in the Old Testament. It says the way to be right with God is to keep the law. And I don't really need forgiveness because I have obedience, right? We're sort of pitting forgiveness and obedience against each other. If I ever fail to practice obedience, then I'll worry about forgiveness. But as long as I stay on this side of the goalie, this side of the forgiveness goalie, on the side of obedience, I'm fine, right? Maybe people need forgiveness over there, and that's fine for them. Maybe they don't know the right thing to do, but I know the right thing to do, and I'll just do that, and then I won't really need to be forgiven. And Paul in this passage is saying, the law actually gives us a mirror back to our own soul. It shows us that we're actually not as good a people as we'd like to believe. As Christians, we're not always as familiar with the law as Paul's Jewish listeners would have been. And so for us, it kind of can seem kind of fuzzy of why that part of the Old Testament is there. And theologians throughout church history have sort of explained it as three different reasons why we have the law today. Right? First one, it's a mirror to ourselves. That's what we're going to talk about today. 2, it restrains evil in the world. And 3, it tells us something about God and who he is and what's pleasing to him. Today, we're just going to sort of talk about that first use of the law, that it's a mirror to ourselves, that when we look at it, we realize that none of us have been justified by the law because none of us have kept the law. So I know some of you guys like self-assessments. You like to know, what Harry Potter house you'd be in. You'd like to know what Myers-Briggs you are, what Enneagram you are. So here's a little self-assessment based on the law. And we won't do all the weird parts of the law. We'll just do the 10 Commandments here. And this comes from another writer named J.D. Greer, who just helps us think through, give yourself a score on a scale of 1 to 10. Anything other than a 10 is failing, but that's okay, on how you do on each of these. You have no other gods but God. That is, nothing has ever been more important to you than your relationship with God. You've never loved, trusted, or obeyed anything more than God, or ever sought to please anyone or anything, including yourself, as much as you seek to please God. How'd you do on that on a scale of 1 to 10? Number 2, you shall not make idols. You've never imagined God according to your preferences or reshaped him according to your prejudices. You've always fully and naturally embraced what the Bible reveals God to be. How'd you do on that one? All right, number 3, you shall not take the name of the Lord in vain. You've never wielded the name of God inappropriately. You've never spoken of him with anything but utmost reverence. You've never been lethargic or apathetic during worship. Anything with God's name attached to it, you've treated with the highest degree of respect. And you've never damaged God's reputation by calling yourself his follower and not representing him well. Number 4, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. You've never tried to live outside your limits. You've never failed to prioritize time every week to cease from your work in order to focus on, trust, and enjoy God. You've always given God the first of your time, your talent, and your treasure. I don't even want to go through the rest of them. This is too discouraging. Number 5, honor your father and mother. Not just your parents, but all authorities in your life you have treated with respect and obedience, giving them honor and willful following. You've never spoken disparagingly of any rightly appointed authority. You've always submitted to it joyfully with respect and honor. All right, we finally got to one that we can keep here. You shall not murder, right? No one's ever murdered anyone. Unfortunately, Jesus points out that the law behind the law here is not just murder, but also hatred in our heart. So you can say, not only have I never murdered anybody, I've never wished harm of any kind to befall someone else. I've never delighted in the misfortune or pain of someone else, even my enemies. You shall not commit adultery. I've never had sex outside of marriage, either in body or in mind. You shall not steal. I've never taken anything that didn't belong to me. I've never taken credit for someone else's work at school or at the office. I've never downloaded something I didn't pay for. I've always respected the property and labor of others, paying for everything I benefit from. And I've never robbed my employer by cutting corners at work. Number 9, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. I've never bent the truth to get out of a bad situation. I've never stretched the truth to get out of something. I've never made myself look better than I really am. I've never slandered another person, and I've always fully fulfilled any promises that I've made. Number 10, you shall not covet. I've never been greedy for something that was not mine, nor have I ever been jealous of the abilities, looks, positions, or possessions of others. In fact, I've always rejoiced with others in what they have, even when I didn't have those things myself that I really wanted. I've never complained about what God's provided for me, and I've always been thankful and fully content with what I have and where I am in life. Now, I wonder what it was like for you to hear me sort of talk about the law that way. For some of you, I imagine you kind of zoned out after maybe 3 or 4 of them. And you kind of were like, yeah, I don't know. I'm not that great a person. I don't even know that I want to be friends with that person. That person sounds really uptight, right? Or maybe you try to sort of make yourself feel better that you're like, oh, I don't know. I'm not living up to that, but who would live up to that? Or at least I'm doing better than people out there. I mean, I'm at church at 8 o'clock in the morning. That's really early to be at church. Maybe you've tried to rationalize it or compare yourself to others. In all those things, or just check out to just try to avoid it, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get out from the weight of the law. Like we just don't want to recognize the fact that we haven't lived up to God's standard. And maybe we've written off that standard as unrealistic or inhuman or not that fun or not, Bob, you're pretty uptight if you're that worried about it. That's someone else's problem, right? But do you see how all of those are attempts for us to wiggle out of what is true and right and good? We have no room to boast in the law, and so we try to avoid it. We haven't kept it, and our obedience, Paul says in this next part, even where we do keep it, isn't unique. This is going to be really difficult for the Jewish believers in Paul's day to hear, because he not only points out that they haven't kept the law, which they can probably agree to, but he's now going to point out that the Gentiles have kept the law according to their own conscience. This is verse 14. For when Gentiles who do not have the law, by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. This is where the comparison part comes in for Paul's listeners, and maybe for us as well. We can kind of handle the fact that we maybe haven't lived up to our standards, but the idea that, or up to God's standards, but the idea that the Gentiles have, where we haven't, would have been really difficult for them to hear. And Paul says why in verse 15. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them on that day when, according to my gospel, God judges the secrets of men by Jesus Christ. So let's think about this part of the passage from 2 sides, from the Jewish side first and then the Gentile side. For his Jewish listeners, and I point this out because most of us would probably, who are more religious in personality or practice, probably identify more with the Jewish listener here. The fact that they have the law is not something worth being proud of. The Gentiles themselves also have a conscience that convicts them of sin, right? They're losing this moment and source of tremendous pride for them. And then for the Gentile, if we look on their side, Paul's telling them there's something positive, right? That you are doing what the law requires, but there's also something negative for them to hear, that they know intuitively that what they're doing sometimes is wrong because their conscience accuses them and tries to excuse them. That is, they can't stand before God and say one day, I had no idea. I had no idea you didn't like 2 crops, planted next to each other, or 2 types of fabric mixed together, or some of these more eccentric parts of the law. What Paul says is, no, you're intuitively knowing that there are things that are right and wrong, and you're refusing to do them. Jesus actually tells us how we know that intuitively in Matthew 7, when he tells us that with the judgment that you pronounce, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. The theologian from the last century, Francis Schaeffer, had a helpful illustration of this, and it's going to sound a little antiquated in the technology, but imagine an old-timey movie, and for the young adults here, you can hopefully understand it. Schaeffer said, and this is not literal, this is an illustration, when you're born, God puts a little tape recorder on the back of your neck where no one can see it, no one can feel it. That's the antiquated technology, the tape recorder. And when you stand before him, he takes that tape recorder from behind your neck and says, all right, I'm only going to judge you according to the things that you've told other people they ought to do. So every time in your life that you said you ought to someone else, that's going to be the law that we're going to tell you that you are going to be judged by. Now, even if we don't like the idea that God has a standard that we are held up against, even if we're not willing to go there yet in our faith or we haven't made that commitment, we intuitively have a sense that we have not lived up to the standards we've made for other people. We haven't done the things that we said to our kids that they ought to do. We haven't done the things we told our neighbors that they ought to do. We haven't done the things that we've told our spouse that they ought to do. We haven't even done the things we've told ourselves that we ought to do. Right? We intuitively know, this is what Paul's saying to the Gentiles, that your conscience bears witness that you have not lived up even to your own standards, much less the standards that God sets out for you. Now, this is a limited point, right? Obviously, our conscience does not decide ultimately what's right and wrong. We don't get to supersede the law of God by just saying, well, I didn't think that was wrong, so it's not a problem. Paul's sort of making an argument from a limited good, right? Even if the law was just your conscience, you haven't lived up to your conscience. Obviously, the law is greater than that. Well, the second thing that he wants them to recognize that they are proud of in a way that's destructive towards others is knowing what's right when they don't do it. There's this temptation in knowing the law that we think that if we just knew the right thing, then we would do it. If God would just tell us what he wants us to do with our lives, then we would obey. Have you ever heard someone say that? If God would just show me his will for my life, then I'll do it. And sometimes that's born out of a genuine sense of worship. But then we read the New Testament and we see God's will for our life and we go, oh, close. I just want to know who to marry. I didn't want all that. There's a temptation in knowing the law, Paul says, and that we can become intoxicated by it. These next few verses can sort of be divided into a couple parts. The first part is verse 17 and 18, which describes like this very good religious Jewish person. And the second part that comes with the sort of temptations that go with that sort of identity. And so I want you to notice after I read the first part, maybe you identify with some of those. What are some of the temptations that Paul lays out for religious people in verses 19 and 20? So here's verse 17. If you call yourself a Jew and rely on the law and boast in God and know his will and approve what is excellent because you are instructed by the law. So that's the first part. Like if you're a good person, if you're a good religious Jewish person, and then here's the temptations. And if you are sure that you yourself are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, an instructor to the foolish, a teacher of children, having in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth. This is just an aside thing based on grammar, but Romans is full of these sentences that are the first half of the sentence, and then you'll see a hyphen, and then he'll talk about something else and come back to that sentence later on. So if grammatically this feels like an incomplete thought, it is, but it's perfect. So figure that out, English teachers. So did you notice some of those temptations that Paul points out in verses 19 and 20? He says, if you're filled with the law, you're going to tend to say that you're a guide for the blind, a light for those who are in darkness. You're going to describe yourself or see yourself as especially insightful, knowing what is good when other people don't. That's a temptation. It's a temptation rooted in some truth, right? That's where the Jewish people are supposed to be a light for the nations. Yeah. Were the nations supposed to be described as blind? Not exactly. Right? The second one, you're an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of children. Were the Jewish people especially chosen? Yeah. Were they to be condescending to their neighbors, calling them foolish and children? Not exactly. Number 3, you're having in the law the embodiment of truth and knowledge, right? That in their persons, their embodiment is what is true and knowledgeable. That they themselves were the especially moral ones. Was Israel supposed to be that? Yes. And that's probably a pretty grandiose way to describe it. But why am I pointing this out? Because I think those temptations are there for us today, maybe especially for those of us who are more active in our faith. that we're tempted to see ourselves as the embodiment of truth and knowledge, as verse 20 says, that we're tempted to see ourselves as lights for the blind, that it's up to us to sort of wag our fingers at others. What is supposed to be a God-given role of announcing the law to the nations becomes twisted into a source of pride and judgmentalism. And Paul drops the hammer in verse 21 and says, even if all that was true and you knew all that, do you do it? This is the second part of the sentence, verse 21. You then who teach others, do you not teach yourself? While you preach against stealing, do you steal? You who say that one must not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who boast in the law, dishonor God by breaking the law? For as it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. Now, there's a lot of questions that commentators have about when these things happened. Jewish people never robbed temples. Commentators spend a lot of time trying to figure out what Paul was saying there. But I think that the bigger point of the whole passage is that knowledge alone is not enough to shape right behavior. This tells us something really important about human nature, right? That it's not just enough to know the good in order to cause us to do the good. And you know that, right? Anyone who's ever taken a class on diet and exercise and then said, oh, I understand, I'm not supposed to eat donuts. That's it, right? Now I'll just never eat that again, right? Knowledge is not enough on its own to shape behavior. Agreeing that something is wrong doesn't seem to be enough to keep people from doing it. And you know this in your own life, not just with diet, but with your character. I will not get angry at my kids. I will not, the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God. I know that Bible verse. I'm just going to come home and I'm going to be calm when they're crazy and I am going to help them see the goodness of God and not get angry at them. And then you get kicked in the shins and then you get hit in the nose and it's like, stop it, right? You're like, I got angry again. Why is it so hard to stop that? Or for others of you, it's issues with alcohol or pornography or other addictions where you say like, I'm going to stop. I know it's wrong. I know it's destructive. I know it's destructive for my life. I know it's destructive for the people around me. I know it's displeasing to God. I'm going to stop. I have this knowledge. And by the way, I understand the irony that I'm giving a sermon on the fact that knowledge alone is not enough to change us. I appreciate the irony. But this is a big theme in Romans, especially in Romans 7, which we'll get to in a number of weeks. Paul will say in Romans 7, I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want to do, but I do the very thing that I hate. Right? The law, the knowledge of what is right and good is not enough in and of itself to change our behavior, is it? We need something else. So why does Paul bring it up here? Well, he's demonstrating the law did not prevent them from doing what was wrong. They knew what was good. And the result of just having the law without any sort of outside force to obey it results in hypocrisy. And he says there in verse 23, or verse 24, that hypocrisy results in God being blasphemed among the nations. Now, I wish I could say that ended 2,000 years ago, but that continues today, right? Hypocrisy leads to people blaspheming God even today. Right? You hear that all the time. Well, if religious people were such good people, then why did that pastor do A, B, and C? I grew up in a church and my parents did A, B, and C at home. I used to go to a Christian school, but all the kids there did all these terrible things, right? Hypocrisy leads to blasphemy of God's name. So where does that leave us? What are we supposed to do about that? Well, I'm sorry, but we're going to have to leave that for the later part of Romans. Right now, Paul is just showing us that the law itself, knowing what is good, doesn't solve our problems. All right, the last source of pride that the Jewish people had that Paul tells them is not where it should rest is on the issue of circumcision. Now, let's talk about circumcision. This is always a fun topic. What is circumcision? I'm an adult. I can do this. Circumcision is the removal of the foreskin from the penis of a male Jewish boy, usually at 8 days old, though in the Old Testament we see it sometimes even up until adults. That's what circumcision is. So the bigger question, though, is why? Why? I think anyone who learns about circumcision for the first time goes, why is that a thing? Like, why would they have that? And it goes all the way back to Genesis, to Abraham. It's commanded by God as a mark of the covenant. Now, you say, okay, that's that's fine. There are other ways you can mark a covenant. Like a tattoo would be better, or an earring, or just like a really good recipe for pizza. Like there's other ways we can mark a covenant. Why this marker of the covenant? Well, to understand that, you have to understand covenants. Even today, and we can talk about this with weddings and stuff like that later, but certainly in the Old Testament, covenants were sacramentalized, right? They were made sacred by an enactment of what the consequences were for the person who broke the covenant. So you would have people sort of throw dirt on their head and say, may I be buried if I do not keep the terms of this covenant? You'd have people tie their hands and say, may I go into slavery if I do not keep the terms of this covenant? All of them were meant to be sort of representative, ceremonial enactments of the harm that would come from someone not keeping the terms of the covenant. Okay, so then the question becomes, why is circumcision meant to be the ceremonial representation of not keeping the covenant? Is it, may I be cut off in my genitals? No, not exactly. In the ancient way of thinking about procreation, they didn't have the same concept of the egg and the sperm that we have today. They just had the idea that it was the man's sperm and semen that caused the baby to be born. And so the tip of the penis was meant to be the source of life, the source of representation of or procreation of the next generation among Israel. And so essentially what circumcision represents is, may our people be cut off, may no one be able to speak of our descendants if we don't keep the terms of the covenant. If that language sounds familiar, it's from Isaiah 53. It's from the suffering servant passage, where it says that Jesus, that the Messiah would be the one who no one could speak of his descendants. That he would be the one who would experience the consequences of the failure of the covenant of circumcision. All right. I got through a lot of words I didn't think I'd ever say at church. All right, there we go. Why is Paul bringing up circumcision now? Well, by the time that Paul's writing, probably Romans written somewhere in the late 50s AD, circumcision had been this peculiar source of pride among the Jewish people. Peculiar in the sense of there weren't other people groups around them who practiced it. It was kind of their thing. And because of that, it was a persecuted element or a sort of shameful element in the Roman and Greek eyes. And so proud Jewish people said, no, this is our marker from God. This is what makes us special. And so there became an enormous debate within Jewish life at the time. Are you willing to take on the shame of bearing the mark of the covenant? Or do you want to be special in Greek and Roman eyes and fail to circumcise your children or circumcise your male children? And because of that, the people who were willing to do it saw themselves as especially moral and spiritual. So that's the background. Verse 25. For circumcision indeed is of value today if you obey the law. But if you break the law, your circumcision becomes uncircumcision. So if a man who is uncircumcised keeps the precepts of the law, will not his uncircumcision be regarded as circumcision? Then he who is physically uncircumcised but keeps the law will condemn you who have the written code and circumcision but break the law. So what's Paul's point? He's saying circumcision itself is a marker of a contract that you haven't kept. To be proud of the contract would be like someone showing up today and saying, hey, I want you to see the terms of this contract. I have the contract. And you say, well, did you keep the terms of the contract? No, but I kept it. I've got it here. Well, why are you showing me this terms of the contract that you didn't keep? He says that's what boasting in circumcision is like. And then he says in verse 28, for no one is a Jew who is merely one outwardly, nor is circumcision outward and physical. But a Jew is one inwardly, and circumcision is a matter of the heart, by the Spirit, and not by the letter. His praise is not from man, but from God. Paul's saying that our need is for a marker of the covenant that's based not on our behavior, but a matter of a new heart. It needs to come from the inside out. It can't be a second chance to do what's right? It's not by the letter of the law, but it needs to include a new spirit. And the result becomes the recognition of God, not the praise of people. So how does this translate to us today? On a very practical level, Christians have long considered circumcision to be an optional activity. Whether you are circumcised or your male children are circumcised is a matter of Christian freedom going all the way back to the time of Acts. I would not encourage you to change course, adult men, on what you've already chosen there. or what your parents chose for you there. But the matter of how the law is fulfilled is timeless and worth reflecting on. And mostly it's worth reflecting on Jesus, right? That Jesus is the one who was cut off for us. He was the one who kept the terms of the covenant, and yet he was rejected. He's the one who has every reason to be proud of what he's done that we don't, and yet didn't stay in that pride, but instead experienced the consequences of our sin for him. So, what are you proud of? What are you proud of? I hope it's not proud of comparing yourself to others or proud of your obedience to the law at the expense of other people. And I certainly hope it's not being proud of the things that you haven't done. But instead, as Jeremiah 9 says, let the one who boasts boast in the Lord. It's not a sense of saying never boast in anything, but to boast in God himself. The longer version of Jeremiah 9, the one that the New Testament quotes in parts often, says this: don't let the wise boast in their wisdom, or the powerful boast in their power, or the rich boast in their riches. But those who wish to boast should boast in this alone, that they truly know me and understand that I am the Lord, who demonstrates unfailing love and who brings justice and righteousness to the earth, and that I delight in these things, justice and righteousness. We're going to take communion here in a couple minutes as we continue our journey through Lent. And I hope that in that time, it will be a time of boasting in what Christ has done for us. Not in our own accomplishments, or our own successes, or even wallowing in our own failures, but in boasting in the gospel of Jesus Christ. Let's pray together. God, I'm grateful for the chance to open your word and to realize how much is in here that I don't understand or that I'm still learning. And I pray for my friends who are here, who have so much reasons to be proud of. They have so much in their life that is beautiful and good, and they're very tempted to sort of rest their identities in those things. God, I pray that they would ultimately find their identity and their boasting in you. God, I pray for my friends who are here who feel like their lives have fallen apart, who feel like there's not a lot that they're proud of. There's not a lot that they are looking to bring up in conversations with other people. God, I pray that in boasting in you, they would find a sense of honor and of joy and of delight. In all these things we pray together as God's people. Amen.